For exactly 24 hours, America had a president nobody elected, nobody knew about, and nobody told. At least, that's what some historians claim. It's one of the strangest stories in American history. A constitutional loophole, a missing president, a forgotten senator, and a single Sunday that may have accidentally created the shortest presidency the United States has ever had. If this story sounds ridiculous, that's because it is. And yet the deeper you dig, the more fascinating it becomes. Because this isn't just a story about one man. It's a story about how history is built on assumptions, technicalities, and questions nobody thinks to ask. Questions like, what happens when America suddenly doesn't have a president? The year was 1849. The United States looked very different than it does today. California wasn't yet a state. The Civil War was still more than a decade away. Most Americans traveled by horse. Telephones didn't exist. Electricity wasn't powering cities. And the nation was preparing for another peaceful transfer of power. Outgoing President James K. Polk had completed his term. President-elect Zachary Taylor had won the election. Everything seemed straightforward, but then something unexpected happened. Taylor refused to take office, not permanently, just for one day, and the reason sounds almost unbelievable today. It was Sunday, March 4th, 1849. Taylor was a deeply religious man. He believed Sunday should be reserved for worship and religious observance. Holding a political ceremony on the Sabbath didn't sit right with him. So when the day arrived for him to take the oath of office, he declined. Instead, he planned to wait until Monday. One day later, problem solved. Or so everyone thought. But hidden inside that decision was a constitutional puzzle nobody had fully considered. Because James Polk's presidency officially ended at noon on March 4th. The Constitution didn't care that it was Sunday. The clock kept ticking. At noon, Polk was no longer president, but Taylor had not yet taken the oath, which raised an awkward question. Who exactly was in charge? Imagine the scene. The White House exists, the government exists, the military exists, the country exists. But the president? Maybe not. At least not officially. And that's where David Rice Atchison enters the story. Today, very few Americans know his name. He isn't carved into Mount Rushmore. He doesn't appear on currency. Most history books barely mention him, but for one strange moment, he became the center of an incredible constitutional mystery. Atchison was a senator from Missouri, an experienced politician, respected by many of his colleagues, and most importantly, he had served as president pro tempore of the Senate. Now, that title sounds boring, but in 1849, it carried serious significance. Under the presidential succession laws of the time, he stood next in line after the vice president. Suddenly, people began connecting dots. Polk's term ended. Taylor wasn't sworn in. The vice presidency was vacant. Did that mean Atchison automatically became acting president? The idea spread quietly at first. Then it became a legend. According to the story, David Rice Atchison unknowingly became president of the United States for exactly one day. No election, no inauguration, no announcement, no parade, nothing. America supposedly had a president who didn't even know he was president. And somehow that makes the story even better, because Atchison himself found the whole thing hilarious. Years later, when asked about it, he reportedly joked that his presidency wasn't very impressive. Why? Because he spent most of it sleeping. Imagine that. You go to bed as a senator, wake up decades later and discover people think you were once president of the United States. No speeches, no wars, no legislation, no executive orders, just a nap. If true, it would easily qualify as the least stressful presidency in American history. But here's where things become genuinely fascinating, because historians started looking closer, and they discovered something important. Maybe Atchison wasn't president after all. The more scholars analyzed the Constitution, the more complicated the story became. Many experts argue that Zachary Taylor became president automatically when Polk's term ended. Not when he took the oath. The oath wasn't what created the presidency. The oath simply allowed him to exercise the powers of the office. In other words, Taylor may have technically been president the entire time, even before taking the oath on Monday. If that's true, then there was never a vacancy, no constitutional crisis, no accidental president, No one-day administration. The legend falls apart. Case closed, except not everyone agrees, because legal scholars continue debating exactly how the Constitution should be interpreted. Some point to the wording, others point to historical practice. Still others focus on succession laws that existed at the time. And that's what makes this story survive. Not because we know the answer, but because we don't. The uncertainty is the entire point. History often feels solid, certain, permanent. We imagine historical events as fixed facts. But sometimes they're not. Sometimes history is a puzzle, a collection of documents, interpretations, and arguments. And occasionally, even the presidency itself becomes part of that puzzle. What's especially fascinating is how close America came to having a real constitutional problem. Imagine if a national emergency had happened that Sunday. Imagine a foreign invasion, a military crisis, an assassination attempt. Who would have been authorized to respond? Who would have been commander-in-chief? Who would have signed emergency orders? Questions that seem funny in hindsight suddenly become very serious. And those questions helped shape later discussions about presidential succession. The government realized that transitions of power needed to be crystal clear. No ambiguity, no uncertainty, no room for debate. Because in a democracy, uncertainty about leadership can be dangerous. Today, presidential inaugurations happen on carefully defined schedules. But in 1849, America was still figuring things out. The nation was young. The Constitution was still being tested, and nobody had really anticipated what would happen if a president-elect simply decided to wait a day. Then there's another twist, one that most people never hear. Even Atchison's claim to the presidency has a major problem. His term as president pro tempore of the Senate may have expired before the supposed presidential vacancy even occurred, which means that even if Taylor wasn't president, and even if there was a vacancy, Atchison may not have been next in line anymore. Think about that. The most famous one-day presidency in American history may rest on a misunderstanding of a misunderstanding. A legend built on technicalities layered on top of other technicalities, and yet people continue telling the story. Why? Because it reveals something deeper about America. We tend to think history is made by great battles, great speeches, great leaders. But sometimes history turns on something absurdly small. A date on a calendar, a religious belief, a procedural detail, a forgotten constitutional question. One Sunday. That's all it took. One ordinary Sunday created a debate that still hasn't completely disappeared nearly 2 centuries later. And maybe that's the most surprising part of all. Not whether David Rice Atchison was president. Not whether Zachary Taylor automatically assumed office. Not whether the Constitution had a loophole. The truly surprising thing is this. One of the most famous presidential mysteries exists because nobody can say with complete certainty what happened during a single 24-hour period in 1849. Think about that. We know the exact locations of ancient shipwrecks thousands of feet beneath the ocean. We can photograph distant galaxies billions of light years away. We can track objects moving through space with extraordinary precision. Yet historians still debate whether the United States accidentally had a president nobody voted for one day. And if a question that fundamental can remain unsettled after nearly 200 years, how many other facts from history are actually stories we've simply agreed to believe?